Welcome to Sleepy Tales, a place where myths and legends are told slowly and softly to help you gently fall asleep. Before we begin, I'd love for you to share where you're from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy relaxing stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a night of our peaceful tales. Now, settle in, relax, and drift off to tonight's bedtime story. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, was a hero famed for his intelligence, cunning, and endurance. He played a key role in the Trojan War, devising the Trojan horse, and faced countless trials on his perilous journey home, including monsters, temptations, and the wrath of gods. This is the story of Odysseus. The call to war and the Trojan expedition. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, ruled his rugged island with a keen eye and a discerning mind. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied on strength alone, he was celebrated for a wit that could pierce through the thickest of troubles and unravel the most convoluted of plots. His reputation was neither confined to his homeland nor limited to the tales told in the halls of his palace. Across the Aegean, among allies and rivals alike, he was recognized as a man whose counsel could shape the tide of battle, whose decisions could tilt fortune in favor of those who chose to heed him. It was his intelligence that distinguished him, his strategic foresight that earned him the loyalty of his people, and his caution that preserved the lives entrusted to his command. The events that would come to define Odysseus's name began with a transgression that reverberated through a Greek world. Paris, Prince of Troy, had taken Helen from her husband Menelaus, an act that kindled rage across the lands of the Hellenes. Kings and warriors from far and wide prepared to answer the call, convening under the banner of a shared purpose: to restore honour, reclaim Helen, and punish the city of Troy for the affront. The muster of Greek forces was vast and formidable, each leader bringing men, ships, and resources, a convergence of ambition and duty. Among them, Odysseus' absence was conspicuous, for Ithaca's strength was needed, yet its king hesitated. Odysseus' reluctance stemmed not from cowardice, but from a deep understanding of the cost of war. He foresaw the years of toil, the loss of comrades, the caprice of gods, and the endless trials that awaited. To avoid this fate, he devised a ruse that spoke of cunning as much as it did of desperation. He pretended madness, a claim that the kingdom might prosper best if its ruler was deemed unfit to command. In the fields, he ploughed as though driven by irrationality, sowing salt alongside seed, turning oxen in circles, and acting in a manner that convinced the observers of a mind untethered from reason. Yet even the cleverest deceit cannot endure without flaw, and in Odysseus' scheme there was a moment that betrayed him. When the herald sought to confirm his madness by placing the infant Telemachus in the path of the plough, the king veered away, preserving his child and revealing the pretense. The act of mercy, though subtle, unveiled the truth and compelled Odysseus to prepare for the journey he had sought to avoid. Once the pretense was uncovered, he was bound by honour, duty, and the inexorable force of fate. Ships were readied, warriors assembled, and the oaths of Greek leaders demanded his participation. Odysseus brought to the campaign not only the ships of Ithaca, but the intelligence and ingenuity that would shape the course of events. From the outset, his role extended beyond the battlefield. While others relied on strength, he relied on perception and foresight, recognizing that victory was as much a matter of cunning as it was of swords and spears. He understood the minds of men, the vulnerabilities of allies and enemies alike, and the shifting favour of the gods, whose whims could elevate or destroy in equal measure. As the war endured, Odysseus distinguished himself through feats of strategy. He counselled patience when rash action threatened to fracture the Greek ranks. He devised ambushes and reconnaissance that ensured supply lines remained intact and that enemy movements could be anticipated. He intercepted intelligence, interpreted omens, and spoke with a clarity that persuaded even the most headstrong of leaders. Where others saw only force, Odysseus saw opportunity. Where others rushed into battle, he plotted with precision. His contributions were not confined to physical acts of valour, but encompassed the realm of thought, the subtle craft of turning circumstance into advantage. Among these endeavours, none would prove more decisive than the conception of the stratagem that would end Troy's long siege. For nearly a decade, the Greeks had battered walls, conducted raids, and endured losses that sapped morale. Troy, with its impregnable fortifications and capable defenders, seemed destined to withstand every assault. In this landscape of exhaustion and uncertainty, Odysseus proposed a plan born of his characteristic ingenuity, a ruse that would exploit the enemy's confidence and pride. The Greeks would feign retreat, leaving behind a gift, a massive wooden horse, hollowed to conceal warriors within. By the stratagem, they would appeal to the Trojans' sense of victory and magnanimity, enticing them to bring the horse within their walls. Once inside, the concealed soldiers would emerge under the cover of night, opening the gates to the returning Greek forces and bringing the city to ruin from within. The execution of this plan required both courage and precision. Odysseus personally oversaw the construction of the horse, coordinated the selection of those to enter its belly, and ensured that the Greeks could feign the retreat convincingly. When the time came, the deception was flawless. The Trojans, believing the horse to be a sacred offering, welcomed it into the city, unaware of the danger hidden within. At night, Odysseus and his companions emerged, and the gates of Troy were opened to the returning Greeks, sealing the fate of the city. This act, more than any other, solidified Odysseus's reputation as a master of strategy, a man whose intellect could achieve what might, brute force, could not. Throughout the war, his mind remained a constant instrument of advantage, a guide for both action and restraint. He recognized the limits of valor untempered by reason and the perils of pride unchecked by caution. In each engagement, he measured risk against reward, sought to minimize unnecessary loss, and exploited the weaknesses of his opponents. Even as Troy burned and the conflict drew to a close, his foresight and cunning ensured that he survived where many fell, that he returned not only with victory, but with the understanding that intelligence and patience were the truest forms of strength. Odysseus's deeds in the Trojan War were not mere feats of heroism. They were lessons in strategy, endurance, and the application of reason under pressure. The journey that began with reluctance and deception transformed him into a figure whose name would endure through the ages. a testament to the power of intellect as much as to courage. Though the war concluded with the fall of Troy and the Greeks' triumph, it was only the beginning of the trials that would define his life. For the path home, fraught with danger and uncertainty, lay ahead, shaped by the same cunning and resilience that had carried him through the war. The fall of Troy and the beginning of the journey home. The city of Troy fell under the weight of stratagem and guile, not merely by force of arms. The wooden horse, conceived in Odysseus's mind and wrought by the hands of Greek craftsmen, proved the instrument of the city's undoing. As the Trojans celebrated what they believed to be the departure of their besiegers, Odysseus and the chosen warriors hidden within the hollow timbers awaited the cover of night. When darkness embraced the walls, they emerged silently, weapons in hand, opening the gates to the returning Greek army. The city, so long the object of Greek desire and toil, was consumed by fire and slaughter, its streets echoing with the cries of the vanquished. The triumph of the Greeks was decisive, yet it was not achieved solely through brute strength. It was the product of careful observation, patience, and the cunning of a single man who understood the vulnerabilities of both men and cities alike. With Troy subdued and the war concluded, the Greek leaders prepared for their journeys home, each guided by differing fortunes and fates. For Odysseus, the thought of returning to Ithaca brought a measure of relief and anticipation. He envisioned the rugged hills of his homeland, the familiar shores, and the palace he had left behind. The longing for home mingled with the weight of responsibility for those who depended upon him, pressed upon him with a force equal to that which had driven him through war. Yet even as the fleet set sail, the shadow of divine influence loomed. Poseidon, god of the sea, harboured a grudge against Odysseus. Inflamed by the blinding of his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and the hubris displayed in victory. The god's wrath would soon manifest in trials that no mortal could anticipate or evade, reminding the hero that even cunning and intellect could not fully circumvent the will of the divine. The voyage began under favourable skies, with sails full and oars cutting through the waters with precision. Yet the world beyond Troy was no less perilous than the war they had left behind. The Greeks first encountered the land of the Ciconis, a people skilled in both defence and retribution. Odysseus, seeking to establish control and ensure resources for his men, led a raid upon their settlements. Initially successful, the Greeks carried off plunder and inflicted damage upon the defenders. But their triumph was short-lived. Reinforcements arrived, and the Cicones counter-attacked with the ferocity born of necessity. Losses were taken, men were struck down, and the fleet was forced to retreat. This early encounter served as a warning. The path home would demand not only strategy and courage, but vigilance and restraint. For every action carried consequences that could multiply in unforeseen ways. Following this trial, the fleet sailed to lands that tested limits of desire and reason. Among these was the realm of the Lotus Eaters, a people whose sustenance came from a plant that dulled the mind and sapped the will to return home. Several of Odysseus's companions, succumbing to its enchantment, forgot the longing for Ithaca, and lingered in idleness, content with ease and forgetfulness. Odysseus, perceiving the peril of lingering too long, acted with the steady prudence for which he was known. He forced his men back to the ships, countering the seductive lethargy of the lotus with the urgency of their mission. Here, as in battle, he demonstrated that leadership was not merely a matter of strength or cleverness, but of the ability to discern threats of a subtler nature, and to act decisively to avert them. The sea itself proved an unceasing challenge. Wind shifted without warning, currents carried the ships off course, and omens and signs demanded interpretation. Each voyage demanded skillful navigation, for a single error could lead to loss or disaster. Odysseus, though renowned for his intellect, recognized the limits of mortal ability when confronted by the whims of gods. The anger of Poseidon began to make itself known, subtle at first in the form of unfavourable currents and sudden storms, then more pronounced as obstacles multiplied. Islands that appeared as safe harbours often concealed hidden dangers, reefs and shoals that could tear the hulls of ships or strand them in isolation. Each night on the open sea was fraught with anticipation and unease. The men of Ithaca and of Greece alike, aware that survival depended upon vigilance, skill, and the favour of forces beyond mortal control. Despite these challenges, Odysseus' leadership remained steadfast. He organised watches, managed provisions, and assessed the temperament of his men, recognising that despair and fear could be as destructive as any external threat. Each encounter, whether with hostile peoples or the treacherous sea, provided lessons in resilience and judgment. He weighed action against caution, realising that both were necessary in turn. Boldness to seize advantage, and prudence to avoid ruin. Even the moments of respite were brief, for the journey itself was an unbroken sequence of trials, each demanding awareness, strength, and the application of knowledge gained through experience and reflection. Thus, the departure from Troy marked not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a different kind of trial. Victory in war had been hard won, yet the sea, the lands beyond the horizon, and the forces of the divine presented new challenges that would test Odysseus in ways the battlefield never had. The Cicones had demonstrated the cost of overreach. The Lotus Eaters had revealed the dangers of temptation and inertia. The storms and shifting currents of Poseidon's realm showed the limits of human control. Each step of the voyage demanded ingenuity, courage, and the patience to endure setbacks that could not be overcome by strength alone. In the early stages of his homeward journey, Odysseus' character was revealed not merely as that of a warrior, but as a man capable of reflection, foresight, and measured action. He confronted danger with both prudence and resolve, led his men through adversity without yielding to despair, and maintained a vision of Ithaca that guided every choice. Though the memory of Troy's fall lingered, and the glory of victory was still fresh, his focus turned outward to the challenges that awaited, aware that the true measure of a hero might not lie in conquest alone, but in the ability to endure, navigate, and ultimately return to those who awaited him. Trials and tribulations at sea, the voyage from Troy, meant to lead swiftly to Ithaca, proved to be an odyssey of peril beyond mortal reckoning. Each island, each shore, presented trials that tested both body and mind. Odysseus, though tempered by war and guided by intellect, discovered that cunning alone could not forestall the unpredictable wrath of gods or the strange designs of the world. His journey became a succession of challenges, each demanding ingenuity, courage, and the vigilance that had earned him renown among men. One of the earliest and most formidable of these trials came in the form of the Cyclops Polyphemus, a creature of immense strength and primitive cruelty. Odysseus and his men, seeking shelter and provisions, found themselves trapped within the Cyclops' cave. The creature's bulk and force rendered conventional combat useless. The Cyclops consumed men with merciless appetite, and the hours stretched with mounting despair. Yet Odysseus' mind, ever alert to possibility, devised a plan that balanced guile with audacity. He introduced himself falsely, deceiving the Cyclops as to his identity, and when the moment presented itself, he and his companions blinded the creature with a sharpened stake. Escape required further cunning. By clinging beneath the bellies of Polyphemus' sheep, the men avoided detection, slipping past the monster's grasp as it counted its flock. The success of this enterprise depended not on brute strength, but on calculation, courage, and an understanding of the creature's predictable patterns. Though victorious, Odysseus could not resist the impulse to proclaim his name to the departing Cyclops, an act of pride that incurred Poseidon's deeper wrath, ensuring that the god's vengeance would shadow every subsequent voyage. The perils of men were mirrored by those of gods and spirits. On the island of Aeaea, Odysseus encountered the sorceress Circe, whose powers could transform men into beasts, and whose allure threatened to detain him indefinitely. Here, restraint and wisdom were as vital as courage. With the aid of divine counsel, he resisted her spells, and in turn gained knowledge of the forces arrayed against him, learning the routes of safe passage and the nature of dangers yet to come. Circe's domain offered temporary refuge, yet it was also a place of instruction. Time spent there honed Odysseus' foresight, tempering the boldness that had served him with prudence that would be essential in confronting future trials. The island became both haven and classroom, imparting lessons in survival, in strategy, and in the careful weighing of desire against duty. Further on, the voyage demanded navigation between terror and temptation. The sirens, whose songs promised forbidden knowledge and the lure of forgetfulness, sought to draw Odysseus and his men from their course. Recognizing the peril, he took measures that balanced survival with experience. His men's ears were stopped with wax, and he himself was bound to the mast, granting him a glimpse of the siren's enchantment without succumbing. The episode reinforced the necessity of restraint, the recognition that insight without discipline could prove ruinous. Each encounter reinforced the fragile boundary between intellect and folly, between curiosity and the surrender to forces that sought to undo him. Beyond the sirens lay further hazards of nature and myth. Scylla, a creature of many heads, and Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool, demanded navigation with both courage and calculation. To face them was to choose between certain loss and perilous survival. Odysseus, understanding that each choice carried consequences, guided his fleet with measured resolve. He accepted the loss of men to Scylla, knowing that attempting to confront both threats equally would risk total annihilation. In doing so, he balanced the moral weight of necessity against the instinct to protect, learning that leadership often required decisions that were harsh yet necessary, guided by reason where emotion might falter. Odysseus' trials were compounded by the consequences of pride and indulgence. On the island of Thrinacia, the sacred cattle of Helios offered sustenance, but also a test of obedience and foresight. Despite repeated warnings, the men, driven by hunger and disregard for divine command, slaughtered the cattle. The outcome was immediate and severe. The wrath of gods manifested in storms that destroyed ships and claimed lives, leaving Odysseus as one of the few survivors. In this, the lesson of restraint was harshly impressed upon him. Even the cleverest mind and the boldest spirit could be undone by impulse and the failure to respect forces beyond mortal comprehension. The price of indulgence, whether in disobedience or pride, was always exacted in full measure. Poseidon's continued anger remained an unyielding shadow. Every storm, every unfavourable wind was a reminder of the god's enduring grudge. Navigation became a contest not only with the physical challenges of sea and land, but also with divine influence. Odysseus learned to interpret signs, to read the currents and the skies, to balance action with patience, and to marshal his men through crises where failure would mean total destruction. His leadership demanded constant vigilance, his intellect applied ceaselessly, and his endurance tested beyond the limits of ordinary men. The sea became a crucible, shaping character through adversity, and the hero emerged both tempered and aware that no victory was complete without the wisdom gained through hardship. Throughout these trials, the qualities that had defined Odysseus at Troy, cunning, courage, and strategic foresight, remained essential. Yet he also learned the limits of intellect when confronted with forces beyond human control. The voyage was a series of challenges that tested not only skill but moral resolve, requiring the balancing of desire and duty, of immediate gain and long-term survival. Each trial offered insight into the nature of heroism. It was not merely the capacity to fight or to deceive, but the endurance to persist, the prudence to act judiciously, and the capacity to guide others through dangers both seen and unseen. By the time the fleet approached the far reaches of the known world, Odysseus had become a figure shaped as much by endurance and wisdom as by courage and cunning. The Cyclops, Circe, the Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, and the consequences of Helios's cattle had all left their mark, refining his mind, honing his judgment, and fortifying his resolve. The journey was no longer a straightforward passage from Troy to Ithaca. It had become an Odyssey in every sense, a test of human capability against the vast, capricious, and often cruel forces of the natural and supernatural world. Each danger endured, each temptation resisted, each loss suffered, contributed to the making of a man who would be remembered not merely for victory in war, but for mastery over trials that demanded intellect, courage, and endurance in equal measure. Nearing Ithaca, loss, reflection, and wisdom. The journey that had begun with the fall of Troy stretched endlessly, each day upon the sea, a reminder of the forces that shaped fate and the fragility of mortal endeavour. For Odysseus, the passage of time brought both hardship and reflection, a gradual accumulation of experience tempered by loss and perseverance. The final leg of his voyage was marked by trials less visible than the monsters he had encountered, yet no less formidable. The endurance of isolation, the temptations of comforts, and the quiet test of longing for home. Upon the Isle of Ogygia, Odysseus found himself detained by the nymph Calypso, whose immortality and desire bound him to her shores. Time unfolded in a peculiar rhythm there, measured not by struggle but by days of ease, tending to provisions, and the faint insistence of hope and despair in equal measure. Calypso offered him what few mortals could claim: sanctuary, safety, and even the promise of eternal life should he remain by her side. Yet Odysseus' mind remained fixed upon Ithaca, upon the rugged hills, the palace of his kingdom, and the family he had left behind. The temptation to forget trials of years was present, yet it was countered by the more powerful force of memory and desire, the unyielding need to return, to reclaim what was his, and to fulfill the obligations of home and family. In this, he discovered that heroism was as much a matter of restraint as of courage, that the soul could be tested even in the absence of external threat, and that endurance was measured not only in the face of monsters, but in the governance of desire. The guidance of Athena, ever vigilant and attentive to his plight, proved essential during this stage. The goddess, in her wisdom, intervened subtly, offering counsel and favour that would allow Odysseus to resume his journey. Her aid came as both knowledge and providence, ensuring that when he departed Ogygia, he did so with the necessary resources and the understanding that his course would be perilous yet attainable. The divine hand, though unseen by men, underscored the dependence of mortals upon forces beyond their own making, reminding Odysseus that intellect and courage, though vital, were complemented by insight and the favour of those who governed fate itself. When at last the sea yielded to the prow of his ship, Odysseus approached the land of the Phaeacians, whose hospitality and discernment offered a reprieve and a mirror for reflection. There, among a people whose skill in navigation rivaled that of the Greeks, he recounted the story of his Odyssey, the breadth of his trials and the depth of his endurance. Every encounter, from the blinding of the Cyclops to the perils of Scylla and Charybdis, was told not for boast, but as an accounting of experience, a record of lessons learned through hardship. The Phaeacians, skilled in both seafaring and discernment, received his tale with the attention it warranted, providing not only respite, but recognition that the feats of men, though often hidden from ordinary sight, could illuminate the capacities of endurance, wisdom, and courage. In recounting his journey, Odysseus reflected upon the nature of his own transformation. The man who had departed from Troy was not the same who approached the shores of Phaeacia. He had been tempered by the necessity of decision, by the consequences of error and pride, and by the unrelenting demands of survival. Each loss of companions, each encounter with forces both mortal and divine, had imparted understanding beyond what could be gained in battle alone. He had learned the value of prudence as well as audacity, of patience as well as initiative, and of foresight as well as immediate action. The cost of these lessons had been high, measured in the lives of men, in the wear upon his own body and mind, and in the years that had passed while Ithaca remained beyond his reach. Endurance had become both shield and measure. The storms and the whims of Poseidon, the allure of comfort on Ogygia, and the seduction of forgetfulness at the hands of the Sirens had all contributed to the forging of a man capable of both vision and restraint. In the contemplation of his experiences, Odysseus recognized the duality of knowledge and suffering. Wisdom gained in ease is uncertain, but wisdom forged through adversity is tempered and enduring. The recounting of his tale to the Phaeacians was as much an affirmation of survival as it was an acknowledgement of the cost of life lived in accordance with duty, courage, and intellect. It was in these moments of reflection that the weight of his journey became fully apparent. The long years, the loss of companions, the enduring hunger for home, and the understanding that heroism is measured not solely by acts of valour, but by the sustained application of judgment, restraint, and endurance. As he prepared to leave the Phaeacians, Odysseus' thoughts were dominated by the vision of Ithaca. The island, once distant and imagined, now approached in both form and reality. He carried with him not only the knowledge of the seas and the world, but the deeper comprehension of human capacity, the need to balance ambition with prudence, the awareness that fortune is fleeting, and the recognition that the favour of gods and allies alike can shift without warning. Each trial endured, each error survived, and each act of courage had contributed to this moment, the convergence of desire and destiny, the penultimate stage of his Odyssey. The final leg of the journey, though still fraught with uncertainty, was approached with the calm resolve of one who had learned through experience. The lessons of the Cyclops, of Circe, of the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, and the consequences of Helios's cattle all coalesced into a deep understanding of human limitation and possibility. Odysseus, tempered by trial, guided by intellect, and aware of the weight of both mortal and divine forces, was prepared to confront the ultimate challenge. Reclaiming his home, re-establishing order, and fulfilling the obligations that had defined his identity long before the Trojan War had begun. Reflection had revealed not only the cost of his journey, but the depth of his own resilience, the scope of his wisdom, and the capacity of the human spirit to endure, adapt, and triumph when guided by both insight and courage. Thus, as the shores of Ithaca approached, Odysseus carried with him a wealth beyond treasure, the knowledge of the world, the understanding of human frailty and strength, and the tempered wisdom of a man who had confronted both the monstrous and the divine. He was no longer merely a warrior returning from war. He was a traveller shaped by experience, a leader tested by adversity, and a man whose endurance and insight would define not only his return, but the measure of his life. Return and restoration. The shores of Ithaca, familiar yet changed by the passage of years, emerged at last before Odysseus. He approached in secrecy, mindful of the forces and circumstances that had taken hold in his absence. His palace, once a centre of order and authority, was overrun by suitors who sought the hand of Penelope, the queen who had waited faithfully for a husband presumed lost. The people of Ithaca, though loyal to their king in heart, had been subjected to disorder and the heavy hand of occupation. Odysseus understood that the reclaiming of his home would require cunning, careful observation, and a deliberate strategy rather than immediate confrontation. Disguised and unrecognized, he moved among those who would have dismissed him, observing the behaviour and allegiances of the suitors. He learned their strengths and weaknesses, their habits and arrogance, and the loyalties of servants and allies. The palace became a theatre of reconnaissance, every detail noted and catalogued, every word and act assessed for the patterns that would allow him to act decisively. Odysseus, tempered by years of trials, recognized that brute force alone could not restore order. Victory would require both patience and intelligence, a strategy that accounted for the human tendencies of pride, fear, and self-interest. He enlisted the cooperation of those loyal to him, men who had remained steadfast in their service, or who could be persuaded of the justice of his return. In this manner, he quietly assembled the means to reclaim his home without alerting the suitors to the full measure of his intent. His strategy, like those conceived during the siege of Troy and the trials at sea, relied on precision, timing, and the manipulation of perception. The suitors, confident in their dominance and blind to the presence of the rightful king, were unaware that their downfall was imminent, orchestrated by a mind honed by adversity and sharpened by survival. When the time came to act, Odysseus revealed himself, unmasking both his identity and the depth of his strategy. The suitors, caught unprepared, were overcome not only by the strength of arms, but by the demonstration of foresight and control that Odysseus wielded. In his reclamation of the palace, order was restored through a combination of decisiveness and judgment, ensuring that the disruption that had taken root during his absence was eradicated with careful attention to fairness and the proper restoration of authority. The process was as much about the restoration of justice as it was about vengeance, a reflection of the wisdom and restraint he had acquired over the course of years spent confronting the extremes of fortune. With the suitors removed, Odysseus turned his attention to those whose loyalty had been tested by circumstance. Servants, allies, and even family were measured for fidelity. Their actions weighed against the enduring bonds of trust and duty. Penelope, cautious and discerning, tested her husband as he had tested others, seeking to confirm the authenticity of his identity and the constancy of his return. Their reunion, long delayed by war, wanderings, and divine intervention, was tempered by the need to re-establish trust and reaffirm the structure of home and family. In this, Odysseus demonstrated not only the cleverness that had guided him through peril, but the insight to recognize the human dimensions of leadership, the value of patience, the need for verification, and the importance of re-establishing the moral and social order. As the palace and the island of Ithaca settled once more into a semblance of normalcy, Odysseus reflected upon the journey that had brought him to this point, the trials endured from Troy to the far reaches of the sea, from the Cyclops and Circe to the Sirens and Scylla, had exacted a cost measured in years, the companions lost, and the perpetual tension between desire and duty. Yet these experiences had also conferred insight, an understanding of human limitation and possibility, the necessity of prudence and courage, and the ability to discern the balance between action and patience. He recognized that heroism was not simply the capacity to perform great deeds, but the sustained application of judgment, endurance, and wisdom in the face of adversity. The return to Ithaca was not merely the end of a voyage, but the culmination of a long process of self-discovery and mastery over circumstance. The trials of his journey, though harsh, had strengthened Odysseus in ways that war alone could not. He understood the importance of strategy and foresight, the value of human counsel and alliance, and the necessity of tempering pride with caution. He had learned that endurance required more than physical strength, that it demanded insight, patience, and the capacity to act with both restraint and decisiveness. Ithaca, restored under his guidance, became not only a symbol of home, but a testament to the growth and transformation forged by experience. In the days that followed, Odysseus resumed the responsibilities of kingship with the understanding that wisdom, like strength, must be exercised with care. He re-established the structures of governance, attended to the needs of his people, and ensured that the justice disrupted by years of absence was restored. The lessons of the journey informed his decisions. Caution in the face of arrogance, the weighing of action against consequence, and the recognition of both mortal and divine influence in the affairs of men. The palace, once a site of occupation and disorder, now reflected the measured authority of a ruler who had endured the extreme of fortune and emerged tempered, disciplined, and guided by experience. In his private reflection, Odysseus considered the cost and nature of heroism. Victory in war, cleverness in deception, and endurance through trial had all been necessary. Yet they were insufficient without reflection, judgment, and the capacity to govern wisely upon return. The measure of a man, he realized, lay not solely in the acts performed under duress, but in the ability to integrate the lessons of hardship into the stewardship of life, home, and community. His identity, long forged in the crucible of journey and struggle, was now reconciled with the responsibilities of kingship and the intimate bonds of family. He was both the warrior and the ruler, the clever strategist and the enduring husband and father. Thus Ithaca, reclaimed and restored, stood as a testament to the culmination of the Odyssey. Odysseus, tempered by loss, trial and reflection, assumed the mantle of his kingdom with the wisdom conferred by experience. He had navigated the extremes of fortune, confronted monsters both mortal and divine, and returned with insight into the nature of courage, intellect, and endurance. The journey was complete, yet its legacy endured. A man whose identity was forged through adversity, whose heroism was defined not only by deeds, but by the capacity for reflection and governance, and whose return marked both the restoration of a home and the fulfillment of the lessons wrought by years of wandering.